and welcome to the Higher Learning Exchange podcast, a space for innovators to push the boundaries of education practice and technology. Hello, I am Carmen Tomás, your host today, and I'm joined today by Douglas Barr to talk about innovative program designs. Hello, Douglas.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Doug is a software developer. He specializes in creative audio applications for the media industries. Alongside his professional work, Douglas has spent several years working in the UK higher education sector. He has been involved in program design, and today we've invited him to talk to us about the design of the BSc in Applied Software Development. It's a degree from the University of the Highlands and the Islands. And Douglas took a very unique approach to teaching and assessment, and hence why we're really, really excited to hear about his case. He included an impressive amount of learner choice. He also improved opportunities for collaboration. The program is completely industry relevant, to the point that IBM is co-delivering this program with the team. And then also this includes remote access. So, okay, thank you so much for being here. And I'll just hand over to you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I suppose an important thing to mention was that the project was really facilitated by some ESIF funding that we got. So we had a funding package that let us assign 2 academics to the project for a couple of years full time, and also a support team. And so I think that's key really to the amount of time and space that we had to think about the program design and really try and kind of gather best practice from across the sector. So that all kind of kicked off in 2017 with that grant, and also with the graduate apprenticeship program starting to become more popular and more widespread in Scotland. And so we originally started looking at the idea of developing a graduate apprenticeship. I think my main concern at the time was that the Highlands and Islands didn't necessarily have the kind of software development industry to support full-time graduate placements in the way that the graduate apprenticeships were designed for. And so instead, we started looking at a way of developing a program that would allow students to interact with potentially lots of different companies across the number of years that they were studying. So that's really where everything started, I think, and trying to just kind of get a degree that was maybe a bit more closely aligned with the way that you would expect a junior software developer to work and learn and progress in industry.
Okay, so I'm just going to let you take us through the main characteristics of this program of study, and
Yeah, sure. So I think everything really comes from this core idea that we had, that we wanted all the work that the students did for, or work that they were doing towards assessment, to be done in teams as part of team projects. There are very few scenarios I've ever encountered professionally where software developers are working on their own. And at the time that we developed this, an awful lot of software development degree courses really focused on individual projects all the way through. And you would maybe do a team project in third year for one semester, and that would be it. So we really wanted students working in teams from day one. And so almost everything else kind of spun out of that. Because one of the challenges is that if you've got students working in teams all the time, well, then they can't all be working on the same thing at the same time. They have to be working on different things to be able to contribute towards that team project. So fairly quickly, we developed the idea of, well, actually, why do we need students to all be working on the same learning outcome at the same time? Why couldn't we design a program where students might all be working on different learning outcomes, and okay, they would all need to kind of be assessed on the same learning outcomes throughout the course of a year, but they don't need to be doing that at the same time. And we also have, within the software development industry, so we've got lots of tools. There's really robust, mature tools within the software development industry to track kind of individual performance as part of a team. So although the students were going to be working in teams the whole time, their assessment was going to be based on their kind of individual contribution. Now, something that both myself and my partner in the development of the degree, Dr. Tom McCallum, felt quite strongly about was this idea of kind of focusing on process over outcome. So if we could make sure that we got the students doing the right sort of things on a regular basis, then we felt that the outcomes should kind of take care of themselves. So we also reasonably soon landed on the idea of really focusing all of the learning outcomes and all of the assessment on the kind of students' individual reflection. So they would be working on these team projects and they would need to build up the practical skills in order to be able to complete the team projects. But it was their reflection on what they'd learned that was being assessed, rather than whether they had managed to use one particular technique or programming language or anything like that in the actual practical work that they were doing. And so we ended up with this this structure that, from the students' point of view, we didn't really worry the students about kind of which module they were doing or anything like that. I mean, we did have to have kind of modules at the back end kind of fit in with the expected kind of assessment bureaucracy. But the idea was that students would just see this series of learning outcomes and they would get them all at the start of the year. Like, here are the things that you need to develop evidence for throughout the course of this year. And we would then organise a series of team projects that they would work on, with the idea being that those projects could be brought in by industry. And so, we would want to try and keep them as relevant as possible. So I think that kind of core idea, hopefully you can already get an idea of how kind of all the decisions we made were really structured around, like, well, if we want all the students to be working in teams, then what else needs to be true to allow that to take place over the full kind of span of their academic career.
I think that's such an important and interesting thought, because you really started from what we're always trying to fit in afterwards. So within that structure, and it's all project and team based, basically, that's the heart of this. So describe assessments, how does that work in this framework?
Yeah, so another little bit of context before I jump into that is that at the time that we were developing this, there was quite a lot of evidence coming out about what was termed kind of underemployment. This issue where you had graduates who should be going for kind of graduate jobs, but weren't necessarily, because they were having, particularly in computing science, the evidence seems to be there was a really big issue with this underemployment in kind of software development and computing, where students were really struggling to see how their skills matched to a job description, for example. And they would look at a job description and think, I don't meet that. And so they would actually be applying for jobs that maybe would be better suited to people with different qualifications. So kind of bearing that in mind as well, that was something we wanted to try and solve for. We really did. We just tried to kind of do everything we possibly could, right? So where we ended up at for assessment is that so we gave the students all the learning outcomes for the year. Said, like, these are all the things that you need to develop work for. Using the tools available to software developers. I mean, these are tools that you would use every day as a software developer in any job that you go for. We had the ability to get students to contribute work to a repository, their repository of work, and they would be able to tag those individual commits to this repository. So we gave every learning outcome a code, and as students were working on projects and they were developing evidence, and they were kind of writing reflections on that, both on what they'd learned technically and what they'd had to do in terms of their team and the project management and all these different types of things. They would tag these submissions of work, and we looked at a lot of research that had been done around things like word count equivalency, and we kind of came up with a system that would give students an idea of kind of how far along each learning outcome they had progressed. Now, that wasn't an indication of their final mark. That was more just an indication for the student of have they gathered enough evidence. So they would have this kind of dashboard showing the learning outcomes. They would be coloured in kind of red, amber, and green. Red was something that they really hadn't developed much evidence for at all. Green was something where they had enough evidence that they could submit for assessment at the end of the year. And they were also then able to, when it got kind of closer to the end of the year, they were able to kind of choose which bits of work for each learning outcome they wanted to actually submit for assessment. Because we had this issue where, like, well, what happens if a student just develops loads and loads and loads of evidence and kind of does the equivalent of submitting a 10,000 word essay when you ask them for a 2,000 word essay? So the students could kind of use this dashboard to and the idea in an ideal world is that they would initially focus on trying to develop evidence across all these learning outcomes and try and make sure they'd kind of covered their bases so that they had enough evidence to submit at the end of the year. And then they could start refining those. They could look back at like previous reflections they had written for a certain learning outcome, and then almost write kind of meta reflections, right? So like, oh, I see back in January, this is how I felt about this topic, and this is what I was writing out. But since then, I've done this other work, and now I've changed the way I think about it. So I had this real opportunity to show growth, and then be able to kind of pick the bits of evidence that they wanted to actually submit for assessment at the end of the year.
Let me ask you, so because this is kind of really quite different to what we're used to. So who is establishing? Did you submit enough evidence? Who is making that judgment? Is it the student themselves, or is it the tutor? And how are the tutors involved? So if it's the student saying measuring, which obviously I can see why you were referring to the back to the employability and students being able to understand what they're developing, because you're building that in at the core. They're constantly reflecting on what it is they're doing and they're learning. So therefore, when they come out, they're going to be filling applications because they know what they've done. They know what they're capable, and they can explain it, which is another massive challenge across the sector. But tell us about, and again, it's so exciting to hear this amount of control and autonomy. So where does the tutor come in at some point?
I mean, another thing that's probably worth mentioning about this course, not directly related to the assessment, but we really tried to stay away from a kind of traditional lecture format, particularly with software development. Everything that an undergraduate could possibly want to learn, there are already at least a handful of incredibly well produced tutorials and really detailed walkthroughs available on YouTube and things like that. So really, as academic staff, we tried to focus very much on kind of supporting the students with their project work and giving them feedback on the reflections and kind of challenging them on what they were learning about. So really we tried to make sure that the kind of majority of contact we had with students was in a kind of maybe what you'd more traditionally assume was a kind of tutorial setting, where we were getting students, so we had several teams on the go at once working on different projects. So for example, we would regularly every week get the students to describe what they'd been doing to the other teams, and discuss that, and then we could kind of help prompt them to think about what learning outcomes they might want to apply things to it, because I would say it's quite a challenging idea, and particularly for new students coming in. And we knew it would be a big challenge, particularly for new students. I guess the way we thought about it was, we know where we want them to get to by the time they're in fourth year. And so if we can start challenging them on this stuff now, and give them quite a lot of support in that first year, they've got 4 years to get really good at doing it, rather than kind of waiting until the very end to suddenly try and put kind of employability skills in and things like that. So yes, we did really try and spend a lot of our contact time with students, supporting them to help them really understand what was expected for the different learning outcomes. They would kind of present something like, oh, well, that's really interesting, but, could you also describe this? And can you see how that might fit in with this other learning outcome over here?
Should we move on to talk about the remote aspect? And what can you tell us?
Earlier, we started the development of this program in 2017. That's when I did the first piece of scoping work. And then the development team came together in 2018, first cohort delivered in 2020. So if you think about that kind of timeline, right, we're developing this pre-pandemic. Myself and Tom McCallum had both experience of working remotely within industry, and kind of knew all the kind of tools and techniques for doing that effectively. And the University of the Highlands Islands is this network of campuses spread across a landmass the size of Belgium. So we felt that we wanted to really focus on equality of access for anyone within that kind of UHI catchment area. And so we were in a kind of unique position at the university. And we knew how to make remote work effective, because we had experience of it, and we knew we wanted to give equal access to everyone across the network. We know that it takes more work. There are a lot of things, particularly in developing a kind of culture and kind of open communication, that are a challenge, and that you need to be very considerate in the way that you design. For example, we pushed really hard for being allowed to use a tool called Slack, which is a kind of messaging platform similar to the functionality within things like Microsoft Teams. At that point, the university was using Microsoft Teams, but very few people were really using the kind of chat functionality. So we had to push really hard to get that access for our students. It's a resource that costs money. And so several things that were a real challenge to get through the approval process. And we were confident that we could do what we were describing. But there was a lot of uncertainty or maybe not uncertainty, but a lot of appropriate challenges from other people within the university at the time. And then, of course, we'd spent 2 years developing this program designed for remote first study. And we were due to be delivering our first cohort in September 2020. So, of course, March 2020 rolled around, and all students were off campus, and all the programs suddenly had to go remote very quickly with very little time to prepare. And so actually a lot of the people that had originally been kind of challenging us on how effective this would be were actually then coming and saying, oh, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, haven't you? I guess, looking back, the the timing was interesting. It did mean that our first year of delivery wasn't really any different, right in the midst of the pandemic and lockdowns, to the way that we had originally designed it.
But so tell us, you've mentioned Slack, which obviously is for collaboration, and also I understand from project management, which makes sense why you would use that. But can you mention maybe how are students completing these tasks, meeting their tutors, if I'm remotely based? I mean, just a little bit more about how the student experience works in this context.
So there was a few tools that we used, actually. So there was Slack, which is really about kind of messaging and communication. And you can set up different channels and have different people organized in channels to discuss things. We used a piece of project management software that's heavily used throughout the software industry, called Jira. And again, that was a kind of paid piece of software that we really had to justify using. And then the tool that the students used to commit their work to these repositories is called Git. And again, it's something that every software developer would use. So these three tools were, they're not the normal kind of tools that most students are going to have access to. Some of them were paid resources. But really, from our point of view, we're trying to justify that these are the tools that industry used and still uses. And so making sure that our students were really, really confident using these was going to be a really, something that has a big impact on their employability. And in fact, we were able to just get lots and lots of testimonials from industry, from different sizes of companies, all saying like, oh yeah, if you get your students using these from day one, that would be great. That would have a huge impact on their ability to then kind of get up to speed very quickly in the kind of corporate environment. And then we had our dashboard that we built on top of the tool for the kind of committing the work. So really, students were encouraged to be in regular communication with their teams. Although they were all remote, they were spending an awful lot of time in video calls with each other and chatting asynchronously on Slack. We would have regular meetings, so each team would be encouraged to have at least kind of daily meetings where they were discussing the progress that they'd made, and then be kind of informally in touch with each other throughout the day on an ad hoc basis. A lot of the staff contact time was set up so that we were also kind of in attending these kind of daily stand-up, these daily meetings that the students were having. This is just how software development teams everywhere in the world work on a daily basis.
I wanted to ask you, so what was the role of the dashboards? So you've explained that students get this outline with all the learning outcomes, and then a guide with scripters that you assess levels of evidence. How did students engage with this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and something I haven't mentioned yet, I suppose, is the other thing we gave them access to on day one was all the marking rubrics and how they would be marked against these learning outcomes. And we worded the marking rubrics in a very careful way where we could make it clear to students that they would be rewarded for consistency of effort. So the fact that we've got these dashboards, we've got this entire commit history of every single piece of work that students had submitted to these repositories. We were really trying to make it clear to them that what we were looking for them to get the kind of top marks in these marking rubrics, they had to be submitting work regularly towards these learning outcomes. Now, that didn't mean that the work they submitted on week one was necessarily going to be directly assessed. They would be building up this evidence and then kind of reflecting on their journey up to that point, and we were also rewarding them for being able to articulate how their their learning journey had gone, and what they found challenging and how they overcame that, and how their attitudes had changed from day one. So really trying to really drive that point home to them, that the dashboard was there so that they could look at how consistently they were working. And what it meant was that, by week 3, it was already obvious which students weren't engaging in the process in the right way, which, you don't normally get that kind of hard evidence of exactly where students are at that early stage of the course. So, of course, right, we had some students, and if you looked, we had these little graphs as well showing kind of how much work they were committing. So they could just look, and there was this kind of expected, this line, this ideal linear line of, committing work, and then they could see how their line kind of compared to that. So, like, of course, there were some students who did work consistently across the semester. And this tool worked really well for keeping them motivated and knowing that, like, great, I'm really on track here, I've got loads of evidence, I should be in a really good place by the end of the year. There were, of course, some students whose graph was dipping fairly far below the ideal kind of line. What that meant for the teaching staff was that we immediately knew who was kind of struggling with the process, and who wasn't engaging with it in the right way. Years in education beforehand, you kind of have an idea of who seems like the more motivated student, students within a certain class, but you don't really know until assessment time, and often so you're not really finding out until maybe week 8 or 10 or 12. So of course, in reality, it's not like every student engaged with this exactly the way we hoped they would. There were some students who did struggle with it, but the system gave us this super early warning system, so that, like I said, within a couple of weeks, we could already identify the students where we needed to encourage them a bit more, or we needed to go and talk to them and see maybe what it was about the process that they weren't understanding. I kind of reassure them that, you've still got plenty of time to make it up and get some plans in place for doing that. So I think it certainly helped. It just lent this transparency to everything. The students knew exactly where they were. We knew exactly where they were. There was no guesswork, and everyone just knew where they stood.
So in fact, that's a privileged place to be, and we know that students, they don't engage how you expect them to engage with everything, and not 100%, right?
Yeah.
But at least, as you say, actually having real time, really early on, real information on actual progress, because everybody else at the moment, they're going by logins to the VLE. And that's the metric that at the moment is, as far as is the limit of learning analytics in the field, which is really shocking considering everything else. So obviously you're getting much richer data on actual learning, and therefore obviously you're always going to have challenges, but you can actually plan interventions well before you find yourself at the end of semester 1, which is what most people get, in mainstream programs. What they will get is at the end of semester 1, maybe they start to see these things that you're seeing in week 3 or week 4, which I think is a real advantage. So thanks. I think we could keep talking, and I think there's so much more to this program of study, but thanks for sharing some qualities that really are distinctive and really innovative. So congratulations to you and your team on this design, and thanks for sharing it. I always like to end asking participants about, what, something that we could be thinking, what innovations do we need to support these kind of designs? If you could have asked for a ready-made tool, or some solution that you really wish had been already available, what would it be?
Yeah, I think so. If we were to take these ideas and maybe try and see them kind of rolled out to other program areas, So, like for example, the tool that students were using to commit their work and the portal, this kind of dashboard that Tom put together. We had to kind of put that together ourselves, and it was a bit clunky, and the user experience where the students needed some kind of technical knowledge to be able to interact with it. And I think something off the shelf that was well suited to that. And these are ideas that have been around in the software industry for a long time. So kind of version control, being able to kind of tag work and commit it and have this entire history of every piece of work you've committed stamped by date. Building something like that was really user friendly and could be picked up and understood very quickly by people who have no need to really understand the kind of technical stuff going on in the background, would be great. I think that would allow a kind of wider rollout of some of these ideas.
Okay. Well, I think we're running out of time, not running out of ideas and interesting points for more conversation. So thank you again, Douglas, for helping us to inspire possibly, other program leaders and to think differently and to also really start to understand what student-centered learning probably is about, and then aligning to the world of work. Thanks for showing your example and your thinking and sharing it.
Thank you so much. Thanks.